Not really, because he, was such a cantankerous, old guy that he wasn't really participating in the show. It was more that Brucker was allowing us to do the show, and I wasn't sure if Von Dutch was for or against the show, but I think he kind of liked the idea of the show. But he was so crazy, it wasn't very good to deal directly with him anyway. And we were hoping to get the show, to have it up while he was alive so maybe he could see the show. We kind of had that as a goal, but then while we were putting together the show, he died. It's weird because I sort of grew up in the surf culture, so I never really heard of Von Dutch. But in the surf culture from Rick Griffin and then Robert Williams and collecting art, then from Robert Williams I started to hear Von Dutch, so maybe that was only in like maybe 1987 was maybe the earliest I'd ever heard of him. And then I would go to some Ratfink parties and I would hear about, Von Dutch was the one or he was the first. But these people weren't that articulate, and I never saw anything that he did, so I never knew anything he did. And so when I went up to visit Bruckers on some trip in the late 80s or early 90s, probably the late 80s, then that's when I first saw, who Von Dutch was, and then I was just shocked that the world, my world, it didn't have exposure to him. But also, it was more like Roth is who I knew ever since I was a little kid, in the culture. I always knew of Roth. And then as I saw hip, younger, like boys, and that they'd never heard of Big Daddy Roth, I thought it was a tragedy because he had so much to give to the culture and sort of having this anti-Mickey Mouse. I thought it was like really important that this whole new generation of kids, there's something in art that they would really like if they just found out about Roth and Von Dutch and Robert Williams. And so I just thought it was really important for a museum to showcase all these people and the artists related to them. It was on one of those trips up to Bruckers, and it might have been the first, it probably wasn't the first trip, maybe the first trip I just saw all the stuff that he had in his office, and maybe on a subsequent trip, but I remember I was there with Craig Stesic. And I think Craig Stesic was maybe videotaping some stuff too, and when we met him, but Von Dutch didn't want to be videotaped.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's when I met him, and I think that was the only time I ever met him.
Okay.
Just that one time. But he somehow hit it off with Craig, and Craig ended up doing some work with the Bruckers, and Craig spent a lot of time with Von Dutch, like in the trailer, and he wouldn't let him record him, I don't think, but it doesn't matter because Craig's got such a photographic memory anyway, but he just spent, I think, hours and days telling, all this Von Dutch wisdom to Craig. Yeah, he came out and they said, here's Von Dutch, we met him, and he just, he had like maybe some overalls on, and he started talking about something like, oh, I worked on this machine, or some interesting fact about like an engine or something like that. And he seemed pretty happy and pretty interested in talking about like an engine or something like that. And it wasn't a very long conversation, but it was a conversation like that. Yeah, we didn't talk about, I don't think we talked about anything about the museum show or anything like that. Might have got introduced like that. He was nice enough, but seeing his art, was a very impressive thing, and I'd never seen anything like that. And imagine that in a museum, and the impact it would have, so I knew it would be really good. But the way that I got a feel for how, because it's so lost, how important Von Dutch was, is finally in the course of doing this show, I got a magazine that was done in the 50s called Dig magazine. And it was like a kid's beatnik magazine, and it had just come out, and it was orientated for kids, and like adults were allowed to read it, and it talked in beatnik talk. And then when I read that magazine, I read every article in there, and so you could see all these like heroes, like a radio disc jockey was a hero, or maybe some movie star guy was a hero, and then they had this guy that was Von Dutch that was like a Leonardo da Vinci reincarnated in a garage with cars and motors and all the wacky stuff he was doing. And from reading that, I could sort of feel like I was in the 50s, and I was a kid, and it all made sense to me, and it was all cool, and it was all new, and it was all in this new language. And Von Dutch was the coolest guy of them all by far. You know, you could just see it. You go, that's why, you know, all these guys were so impressed with him. Yeah. Because back then, if he were there, and that was the only way to know, you knew that he was, you know, like the biggest, coolest guy around. But it wasn't just the article on him. You know, you read all the articles in that magazine, and then it sort of recreated the whole time and everything that was going on, and how Von Dutch stacked up with that. He was just like the most amazing of anybody they profiled. I would probably say that lowbrow art is the bigger thing, and then custom culture would be, you know, like a, you know, under that, and then, you know, yeah, surf art, skateboard art, you know. And I wasn't so much a car guy, but I just really liked the art that came out of the car world more, you know. So then I liked some of the art that came out of the surf world and the skateboard world, and the psychedelic world, the rock and roll world, stuff like that. Yeah, because lowbrow was more encompassing, and custom culture was more car related, and customizing cars and all the art that came from the car world and the hot rod